Next up, we have the superintendent's report, Ms. Miller.
Thank you. I've actually partnered with Nicole, so we have a lot going on right now with school funding, as you all are aware. And I would like to thank Nicole for going down to the State House and testifying last week, and Jen Altman for accompanying her as well. I know Nicole's been able to testify a couple of times. I'm actually signed up to testify tomorrow as well. We have a lot of serious concerns about not only what we saw come out in the governor's initial proposal, but some very concerning amendments that are coming out with the House substitute bill. And so Nicole has graciously put together a few slides on that for us to kind of show what that would mean for Westerville and for public education as a whole in Ohio. I'm really glad we have such a great crowd here tonight to see this because there's just a lot going on, and it's a very concerning time with school funding at a state and federal level. So thank you, Nicole, for sharing these slides with us.
Yeah, so like Angie said, this is something that we all really need to pay attention to and make sure that we are advocating. We talk about the cost of education being a shared responsibility between the state and the local community. The state needs to remember that they need to do their part in that responsibility. So when we talk about the state's budget process, we start with the governor's proposal, which we have that. As we're going around and having meetings with our community and with our staff, those projections in that presentation are based on what was in the governor's proposal. We now have the House's introduced substitute bill for House Bill 96. So it has not been voted on by the full House just yet. This is what's been introduced with all of the amendments and different things for the House, what they've been having hearings on. They are having another hearing tomorrow in the House Finance Committee. Like Angie mentioned, she's going to go down and testify. I'm planning to go down there with her as well, but they're probably sick of hearing from me by now, if I'm being honest. So I will be down there as well, and they're planning to go out of committee tomorrow and get it to the full House by Wednesday. And so we have some real concerns about the House's what's in the current introduced sub-bill version. So, but we're still waiting to see what happens in the House. Then after we do all that, we get to go visit the Senate and go through it all over again with the Senate and what that looks like. So then we come to conference committee, which is Senate and House. They work out the differences between all of those budgets, lots of closed door discussions during that time. So we really want to be paying attention. Lots of things happen quickly. They want to get it to the governor's desk by June 30th. That's the goal, because the state's operating budget needs to start July 1st with their fiscal year. So the governor's proposal overall would mean $6.9 million less in revenue over the next 2 years for Westerville City Schools. And for all traditional public schools, it would be $103 million less under the biennium period for all schools in Ohio. While doing that, it also adds several new requirements for all traditional public schools. I continue to tell people I don't know any business that functions by reducing revenues and increasing services, yet the state continues to ask us to do that over and over again. The House's proposal, they've introduced this provision for a clawback. And what it does is it would require the County Budget Commission to claw back any general fund balance over 25% of the preceding year's expenses. This would be a reduction in our resources for next year of $121 million if that goes through as it sets in that introduced substitute bill. This would devastate our district. This would devastate public schools across the state if this goes through. Overall, the House's proposal allocates an additional $20 per student in fiscal year 26 and $30 per student in fiscal year 27 in the state funding formula. So that callback would be a loss of $121 million next year. And that would go through the local tax levies that we have. Overall, for all state traditional public schools around the state, all 609 traditional public schools, it would be $280 million plus from the state, but over $8 billion fallback from current resources based on the 2024 outstanding balances that schools have. And again, also add several new requirements for that. And when we think about the consequences, so we are required to do a 5-year forecast. We would immediately be in fiscal watch, and that would require state oversight if that were to happen. Once we go into the new fiscal year, it would eliminate the district's ability to meet long-term obligations and state-required certifications.
Nicole, can I just pause you for a second on that first point, because that might be a little confusing to folks as to why we would be in fiscal watch if we had so much of a cash surplus that they were taking it back. Can you just kind of explain what that means on the life of the forecast, please?
That is a great question. Thanks for asking it. So the fiscal watch is what does it look like that third year of the 5-year forecast, and what does that end reserve balance look like? Because that cash balance is going away, and we are deficit spending year over year by over $20 million a year. We would be in a severely negative fund balance overall, the unreserved fund balance.
This is a really important point. I know Nicole talked about in her testimony. I plan to address it tomorrow online. Our associations have been bringing this point up, and we had an opportunity to meet with some of our local legislators on Friday and made this point. You can't just look at the first years. We have a long-range plan that includes utilizing that cash as a stopgap. And so they're only wanting to look at that first year of the cash and not over the cycle and forecast. So that's a really
Even though
important
we're
point.
required to do a 5-year forecast, we're required to have positive unreserved balances in order for us to meet sign any long-term contracts, meet any long-term obligations that we have. We already have obligations based on the fund balance that we do have. We would not be able to meet the long-term obligations that we currently have if they were to fall back that much money from us in our fund balance. It would require substantial cuts in programs and services for all students, likely down to the minimum state and federal requirements. It would jeopardize the district's ability to meet payroll obligations throughout the fiscal year. So our largest source of income are our local property taxes. We receive settlements twice a year for our local property taxes. So we would be looking at, mid-year, would we have enough cash on hand to be able to meet payroll obligations? The other thing that I think is important for everyone in Ohio to understand is that overall bond ratings for public schools, for all Ohio entities really, when we talk with Moody's and Standard & Poor's and their rating, which impacts what our interest rate is, when they're rating our bonds, we generally have good ratings on our bonds because of the reliability of our ability to collect revenues through local property taxes, because local property taxes in Ohio, as they are set in law, are an extremely reliable source of income for local governments, including schools. And that's the way the rating agency views them. And as I shared with the House Finance Committee members during the question and answer period, that if the state starts passing laws that would drastically change or reduce property taxes revenues and not make that a reliable source of income for schools, that would hurt our bond ratings. That would hurt everybody's bond ratings overall, which would raise interest rates, and we would all basically have junk bonds at that point. And so that's a real issue that I think the state, as they're thinking about policy that they're setting, they really need to think about what that looks like. The provision in the House's introduced sub-bill doesn't provide for the next year. So they claw back the revenue, and then there's nothing that brings it back up in the next year. So that would mean that we would be back to the voters every year with new operating levies. The operating levies would likely cost 12.5% more for all homeowners due to the elimination of the rollback. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. In Ohio tax law years ago, prior to 2013, all voted levies for homeowners were reduced by 12.5%. So there was an automatic 10% rollback, and then an additional 2.5% rollback for anyone who lived in their home. Basically, they called it the owner occupancy credit. So 12.5%, every homeowner received a reduction on every new levy, 12.5% off of that levy. the state reimburses the schools for those levies, for that 12.5% rollback for those levies. They eliminated that rollback for all new levies after 2013. So every levy we have passed since then costs 12.5% more than what it would have prior to 2013. However, the state continues to reimburse us for all of those levies that were passed prior to 2013. And we get about $13.4 million overall in a year from that rollback. The state has been talking about eliminating that, comes up every budget cycle. So if we're passing new levies, if they're reducing all of our current levies down to this very low amount, and then we have to pass new levies to get it back up, that's less reimbursement that the state has to pay to the schools. So just rough estimates, it would be about $10.4 million in reimbursement loss to our local taxpayers annually with that. So this is a very real concern for a lot of reasons. I do think that this is something that would require, I think when we're talking about changes like this, it really requires a lot of conversation around what is good public policy for the state as a whole. The state went through, they had a property tax reform and review committee that met over a year's time. They heard from all kinds of different experts around the state about how property taxes work. They learned all of these things, and they produced a report with recommendations from that committee. And this was nowhere on there. The 25% fund balance callback, none of that was on there. I don't know where this came from, and I shared with the House Finance Committee that I really hope, however, this provision came to be in the sub-bill was because people don't understand how property taxes and school funding works, and not because someone is trying to eliminate traditional public schools. Because I really just hope people don't understand how this is going to affect overall. So they're having conversations right now about what will that final sub-bill look like. Hearings tomorrow, and then I think there could be a vote on Wednesday. So we're asking people to please contact the state legislators. These are our state leaders: Governor DeWine, Matt Huffman is the Speaker of the House, Rob McCauley is the Senate President. The House leaders: Speaker Huffman, Speaker of the House again. Brian Stewart is the chair for the House Finance Committee. They are the committee that will determine what that final sub-bill looks like that gets recommended to the full House. Mike Davila is the vice chair, and then Bright Sweeney is the ranking member there on those committees. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we'll be going through this with the Senate probably close to the end of the month. I think when we met with Brenner and team the other day, they said 28th they're expected. So they'll be having hearings on the state's budget coming up. So that's the Senate Finance Committee leadership. And then Andy Brenner is one of our state senators up in the Delaware County area. That's who told us he thinks that they'll be having hearings in the Senate Education Committee the 28th for the Senate's version of the budget. So. And then this is, we'll have this linked on the website, but this is a spreadsheet that shows like how to contact everybody. If you go to this, it'll show you like how it'll show you like all the members of the House, all of their contact information, all the different committees, and then the same thing for the Senate. It's just a Google sheet that I found and copied. And then these are our local legislators, just a reminder. The House is who we're talking to right now. And then the contacts for them. And this will all be online. I don't spend a lot of time here. But these are the committees that we pay attention to. The House Finance, Education, Ways and Means. They have important conversations during the budget process. And then the same thing for the Senate side of things. Questions?
Yeah, I don't, this necessarily have a question at the moment. I do want to thank you. I know we went down and spoke to our legislators in the state house, and then we're proactively setting up meetings with the Senate, seeing the senators over there and working to get in with leadership and trying to be proactive here. You know, we're going down tomorrow to testify. This is really dire. You know, this is the time. Now is the time. So I'm really urging our community to reach out to not just your representative, but also leadership, chair leader, like committee leadership, Senate, House leadership, the governor, and really express how this will decimate our school district. And there's a lot of information online on our website.
I will say there's a lot of groups that are working really hard in this space. Honestly, for Ohio Education is a great group to get some information from. The Ohio Education Policy Institute is also another great resource for information. I think, I tell everybody I've been doing this for 20 years now, and every 2 years I go down the state and beg them not to take money away from us. This feels much, much different than what it's felt in the past, and I think there is a real push to privatize education in the state at taxpayers' expense, and everyone is going to have to speak up. I will say our local legislators have been very responsive. They've been very good about reaching out and asking questions and understanding how this would impact us, and trying to help offer some solutions to some of this conversation. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear about it.
Could you just hit quickly, Nicole? I think it's important to note that it's not just Westerville schools that will be impacted. It's the vast majority of the school districts that will be just catastrophically impacted by this clawback. And I know you've said it before, but we have a nice crowd. And could you just hit one more time, maybe just share about when you were at the auditor's office and just kind of like, why do districts carry cash? What is the point?
Yeah.
Because we know, and I plan on sharing with the legislators, we have lots of needs we would like to spend the cash on. We'd like to buy computers. We'd like to take care of buildings. We're not spending it because we're using it to help with that deficit that we have operationally year over year. We're not the only district in that situation, but could you explain kind of why it's important for districts to have that and what the general standard is on cash?
Yeah, so that's important for everybody to understand. So when we are on the ballot for an operating levy, it generates a fixed amount of revenue, right? So we expect that levy to last us 3 to 5 years, depending on what it is. So so you can think of it sort of like as a bell curve, right? We expect our balance to go up, but then it starts coming down, and we're back on the levy. And we are in that constant cycle in this district, in this area. That's just the way most Columbus area suburbs have worked. We're subject to House Bill 920, so we don't see a lot of growth in our revenue. With property taxes, the state's continuing to say we live wealthier, so we see our state share decreasing, and that's where we are in this space. I worked for the auditor's office from 2005 to 2012. I think everybody remembers the Great Recession of 2008 to 2011. And I worked with school districts and other local governments who didn't have adequate cash balances. And they were criticized for not having adequate cash balances, and they were in fiscal watch and fiscal emergency. That was my job. I worked on those projects that required a lot of state oversight. We told them what they could and couldn't spend their money on. We had commissions that were formed. They had to approve various things. And, now listening to state lawmakers criticizing school districts for being good fiscal stewards of funds and not getting into a position where we have to make severe programmatic cuts for our students because we do have adequate cash reserves, and trying to thoughtfully plan on how to spend those on one-time things and not create new cumulative growth and expenses with it. It's really surprising to me when we think about what is good public policy, right? I think we continue to be asked to do more with less, create efficiencies, all of those things. And for the state to just say you shouldn't have so much cash balance on hand when they're not in this space and understand how this, I mean, most of them don't even understand how property taxes work in the first place, much less the school funding formula, right? But for them to have an opinion on what that looks like when our locally elected officials have adopted a policy after working with our community and our finance committee and our groups to develop what is an adequate cash balance for our school system. And we've created a strategic plan about how to move forward in some different spaces. I take issue with the state thinking that that's their decision and not our local level's decision. I think it's our community's decision. I think it's our locally elected officials' decision. I don't think that this is a decision that should be made at the state level.
I know you kind of alluded to this, but who serves on, like, what kind of people serve on our finance committee?
So we have staff, we have community members, parents, someone from the chamber, lots of different people that serve on that. Always looking for volunteers if you're interested. Feel free to reach out. But yeah, I mean, we worked a long time to develop that cash balance policy, and we have it in place. We've been working with that following. We held the levy in November. We know we're going to have to be on the ballot again in the future. The only reason we're not on the ballot for this May is because of comments made at the state house by some of the state leaders saying that they want to cut funding for public schools. We feel like this is where we need to dedicate our time right now, and that's what we're doing.
Thank you for the presentation, and I just have to say, having been there, I cannot express how lucky we are to have Nicole Marshall up there explaining this to people, explaining this to legislators. So thank you for doing that. You're doing an amazing job. Everyone can watch testimony and get to understand it better. I'm going to make an analogy that's not going to work. Okay. So you have to help me work through where it doesn't work here. Okay. So I'm going to imagine somebody, we're just going to pull a number out. They make $50,000 a year. Okay. New job, you're going to make $50,000 a year for a couple of years, right? Your expenses might be $43,000 a year. So you should put some money away, knowing that your expenses are going to go up the next year, most likely due to inflation. Okay. Then you get to the third year and they say, oh, guess what? You're still going to make $50,000 a year. And yeah, there was that inflation thing, but we're actually going to ask you to do more at work now. You're still getting $50,000. Okay. So you might start to eat into some of that money you put away in year 1 and year 2, right? And then, you might get a chance for a salary increase in like year 5. Essentially, that's sort of like, the levy cycle. So it's logical that it's smart in those first couple of years when you can bring in a little bit more than you're spending, right, to put it away because you're not going to be able to make it in year 3, 4, and 5. So it's a bad analogy in a lot of ways, but I'm just trying to help people sort of think about it's these different cycles, right? So then if at the end of the first year somebody came in and said, okay, well, you're holding more than 25% of what you spent last year, so we're gonna not give you as much. We're gonna reduce the amount we're funding you, right? So your ability then to stretch that out over those 3, 4, 5 years, it completely evaporates because of these different cycles. You've got your 5-year forecast, you've got your 2-year biennium, you've got your, funding formula might change every 2, or whatever the state funding is might change every 2 years, and it becomes impossible to predict.
Right. Well, and as we talked to the committee, our property values are only updated every 3rd year.
Right.
And we have a 5-year forecast that we have to meet. A lot of our employment contracts are about 3 years, sometimes 4. Those are the things that we have to be able to plan for and what that looks like. And we can't certify those things if we don't have the adequate reserves in place to cover them when we don't know where the revenue is coming from. I think, just when I just think about how that might work practically, I don't see how it works in any way because we don't see growth on those levies. And we do see growth in that, the 10% of our millage for inside millage, but it's a minimal amount, not anything near what needs to be kept up with inflation. But that only happens in that every third year with the reappraisals or the updates and values. So, I mean, it's almost like, the old community treasurer said it in our meeting, it would almost be like we have to do like micro levies every single year, like we would be on the ballot every single year. And we wouldn't have, for our homeowners, like that 12.5% rollback wouldn't be from the state anymore, they would be paying it. And so it doesn't make sense with how we are required to do things. And, and I've shared with a lot of people, there are so many different laws about fund balances and certifications and all of those things. I'm not sure that the state has enough time to adjust all of the laws that would be required to be adjusted in order for them to be able to make that change. The other thing too is at the same time the auditor state is working on a system, I don't even know what they're calling it, but basically it's a test to determine whether a district is experiencing fiscal distress. And of course it's schools, right? It's not everybody, just, schools, public schools. And they're looking at like some 16 different markers about, how much our revenues are, how much our expenses are, and what that looks like, and what the trend is year over year. And so they're working on that at the same time that the state is wanting to drastically reduce all of our fund balances. Like I can't reconcile it in my head, especially with, there's statute around fiscal watch, there's statute around fiscal emergency, fiscal caution, like those different designations from the state level that require the state to oversee how we use our funds, basically. There's so many different things in law. I don't know how they could make this work. It's very frustrating because, and this is time too, right? Like this is all of the time we have to spend trying to make sense out of all of this. And this is like a roller coaster that we go through with every biennium budget, but we have to know how it's going to impact us so that we can help educate the legislators. And what I do like to remind people is that the people in the legislature, they're not necessarily experts in school funding, and in fact, most of them are not experts in school funding. I doubt any of them are, honestly. You might have some that have had some experience in this space and have learned along the way and gotten familiar with it. But this isn't just like the state's budget in regards to education. This is the state's operating budget, so it's everything. So they have to be thinking about Medicaid and the prison system, and, all of these things. And so I view our job is to help educate them. Like, hey, you might not realize this, but when you're thinking about that provision of that bill, this is how it's going to impact our community. And like, as long as they understand that, I think it's helpful if we're just kind of reminding them of how these things impact us. Because some of them don't know. Some of them aren't. They just don't work in this space, and they have their different committees that they serve on. So that's why we're here to help educate.
Thank you.
Nicole, I have a question that I think I know the answer to, but want to get your weigh in on it. So this is kind of the budget piece and what's happening with public ed. What's going on with the vouchers?
That's a great question. So the vouchers are estimated to grow even more than where they are now overall.
So they're cutting funds from the public ed side, but they're adding to the voucher side, which goes towards private and charter. Expanding on that. Okay. Nicole, thank you for the presentation. As Jen said, this is super helpful. I think one of the things that I want folks to come away with from this presentation and what we're talking about is that the state of Ohio, the legislators are making choices. This is a choice. The money is there to fund this. They are making a choice to put it elsewhere. I think if my notes are correct from the meeting that I was in with All In for Ohio Kids, $530 million more this year for voucher private and charter school education. That does not need to go to private and charter school education. That is a choice that they are making. So we're talking about educating our legislators on how this is going to decimate public schools. 90% of Ohio's kids go to public schools. We already, gave $1 billion to the voucher program last year, and we're going to throw another $530 million on top of that, while at the same time defunding the schools that the vast, vast majority of our children attend. It makes no sense unless either A, like you said, they really just don't understand this, or B, and this has been Matt Huffman's fever dream for a long time, they want to privatize education. They want it private. They want somebody making money off of it. There's no other explanation for how you get to this point unless that is your goal. So it's extremely frustrating. I want to thank you guys for going down to the State House and testifying, and for everybody else in the community who has been doing this, because if nothing else, we need them to know we're paying attention and we know what you're doing. It's super frustrating.
I'll just add though, I think Nicole made a good point that they are listening. So they are starting to, we've had some of our representatives reach out, say, what can we do? What kind of amendments can we put forward, even though they're being locked out of the room at the moment. But we need our community members to also reach out to the people they know in Ohio, in rural areas, in suburban and urban areas, and make a point to help educate them. Not particularly on how it will impact us here in Westerville, but across the state. I told the legislators, my husband and I intentionally picked Westerville City Schools to raise our children in. I am a product of it. My husband went to Lakewood Local, and our children are being penalized because we chose public schools over private schools. So it's just my last ditch effort for a plea. If there's nothing else, then we can move along to public comments.